More than all the stars in the sky. Written by Skib Scribbles. Summary. What do you mean they don't twinkle? Marcy grinned as she faced Sasha. They don't twinkle. Then what the hell is the point of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star? Sasha watched Marcy shake her head. They don't twinkle. They emit. So why do we say that they twinkle? Marcy shrugged. Maybe it's because it's catchier. Or Sasha and Marcy go stargazing a lot to try and have a moment together to forget the world's many problems. Marcy stared at Sasha through the window. The blonde was standing outside on the floor below, leaning on the trunk of the tree. A forced smile played on her lips. Marcy sent a tight smile back before moving further into her room. Tonight wasn't going to need a lot. She looked over at her pajamas, some green sweatpants, and a large white t-shirt. Marcy tugged a black hoodie on, a green beanie, and some black gloves and sneakers. It wasn't the best look, but it was comfortable, and it would keep her warm. It was always awfully cold at 1 a.m. outside. Besides, the only one seeing her tonight was Sasha, and she wore much of the same. Marcy slid the window open and peeked her head out, sending a more genuine smile at Sasha. The blonde below huffed out a silent laugh. Her warm breath came out in a cloud from the cold air. Sasha was wearing black sweatpants, a red hoodie, and a matching beanie and gloves. Her black sneakers blended in with her shadow. Marcy glanced at the tree, its branches reaching for her window, but had yet to connect. She felt her face twist in concentration. Could she make that jump? Just drop! Marcy glanced down as Sasha moved forward with a smile on her lips, a puff escaping every time she spoke. I'll catch you, and we can deal with the tree when we get back. Marcy glanced between the tree and her friend. The branch was sort of far, but so was Sasha. It'll be like cheer practice. Sasha's eyes took a softer look as she reached her arms up. I won't let you hit the ground, I promise. Marcy took a shaky breath. Okay. And jumped out. For a moment, she was weightless, dropping through the air, cold air whipping against her skin, before colliding with Sasha's waiting arms. The blonde barely even grunted, and Marcy couldn't help giggling, letting out an exhilarated breath. See? I caught you. Marcy grinned as Sasha put her down. So where did you want to go for this impromptu hangout? Marcy watched Sasha think. The blonde had texted her earlier that night, saying she wanted to hang out. This wasn't exactly what Marcy had in mind, but if it's what Sasha wanted. Sasha looked a little unsure for once, her eyes darting everywhere, wringing her own hands and licking her lips. Marcy smiled as she grabbed Sasha's hands, trying to ignore how much she was shivering. Take your time. They were 12. It wasn't like they had any obligations anywhere. Sasha took a shaky breath. Marcy squeezed her hand. Can we go to the park? Sasha's eyes widened. Please? It sounded like an afterthought, a late addition to the question. Marcy smiled. Of course. The pair walked holding hands the whole time, the only sound being the steps and breaths they took. Eventually, Marcy and Sasha found the park, both moving over to the swings, never letting the other go. Each of them claimed a swing, sitting on them as they slowly moved back and forth, the creaking from the rust being the loudest noise. Do you want to talk about it? Sasha shook her head, letting out another shaky breath. Marcy just nodded, glancing around the park. They were a little young to sneak out of the house, but it wasn't like their parents were paying much attention to either of them. The park was a little creepy, though. The darkness gave it a different aura. Sasha sniffled. Marcy glanced over. Her friend was crying. That was weird. Sasha never cried. And she didn't want to talk about it. Marcy bit her lip. She had to distract her. What should she do? She began looking around. What could interest her friend? Her head swinging around the park for anything. What? There. Marcy squeezed Sasha's hand, a way to bring the blonde back to the park. Hey, Sash, Do you like stars? The blonde stared at her weird, voice cracking as she spoke. Yeah? Marcy smiled, keeping her eyes on the sky as Sasha sniffled again. There aren't many because of light pollution, but ignoring scientific reasons, we can say that the ones we do see are the strongest of the bunch. Sasha was calming down, at least that's what Marcy thought. They don't have a lot of color or variety, but that's because of us humans. We don't treat them very well. Marcy fell silent for a moment. She wasn't sure if Sasha wanted her to keep going, only for her to feel Sasha's hand momentarily squeeze hers. Really? Marcy turned to the blonde. Her eyes were pink, and there were even tear tracks going down her face. But she had a genuine smile. Marcy grinned. Yeah, people aren't really good at taking care of nature, but everything adapts and comes out better from it. Stronger. I should know. Sasha gave her a weird look. Bingo. Marcy smiled, tightening her grip on Sasha's hand. I have a star in my hand right now, and despite all the harm the world has done, she still shines brightly. Sasha's cheeks flared up instantly as Marcy laughed. No doubt if asked, her friend would blame the cold. Whatever, nerd. The blonde turned away, but her grip tightened too. They spent a few more hours outside messing around and commenting on the sky, just imagining what it would feel like to be free like the stars. Eventually, the pair walked back, but only once they were starting to doze on the swings. One hug and a disastrous tree climb later, Marcy was up in her room, plucking a few leaves from her clothing, letting them drop on Sasha, the blonde playfully sneering as she moved away from the window. Marcy watched as Sasha mouthed a small, "Thank you." "Anytime." As Marcy took off all the extra clothing and sneakers, she thought about her words. She meant them. Still does. But it probably won't happen again. Sasha means well and was a different person tonight, but it was probably a one-time thing. Marcy heard her phone vibrate. A text. Marcy smiled. Sasha made it home. Content, she crawled into her bed, yawning as she thought about her time with the blonde, seeing a side of her that was new. Her eyes drooped. Maybe they could have a better friendship that didn't require Anne's presence all the time. Assuming this would happen again, but that meant more problems that they felt the need to sneak out. Hopefully that wouldn't be the case. Surely their parents would be nicer. Marcy burrowed deeper in her blankets, one last thought bouncing around her mind. Maybe they would pay more attention to them, love them like Aaron's parents loved them. They would not. The next time they hung out, Sasha had gotten a text from Marcy. Her phone had dinged as she was about to crawl into bed, letting out a huff as she read it. Marbles. Can we hang out? Like, right now? Please? Sasha's brow furrowed in concern. That was weird. Okay. One wardrobe change and a brisk walk later, Sasha found herself standing by the tree. At 1 a.m, she found herself by it once more, after having been here about a week ago. Should she text her? Be cliché and throw a rock at Marcy's window? Sasha was saved from deciding by the sound of Marcy's window sliding open. Sasha's gaze shot up in time to see Marcy climbing out, nearly ready to slide off the sill. She was oddly quiet. Wordlessly, Marcy dropped. Sasha surged forward, catching her in her arms. Marcy was already shivering from the cold. Should she send her back up to put on some more layers? For a moment, they just stood there, Marcy in Sasha's hold, head in her neck, as Sasha's mouth fell open and closed. What was she supposed to do? How did one do feelings? Are you okay? Marcy answered with a sniffle. So, no. Sasha felt Marcy's shoulders shake. She couldn't tell if it was because of tears or laughter, though. The blonde let out a huff, glancing at the sky. There were some stars. She shut her eyes for a moment. Marcy did this for her last time. She supposed she could do the same. Sasha's eyes snapped open. She's got this. Come on. Sasha lowered Marcy, her friend falling into step behind her. Marcy was crying, that much was obvious, but it'd take some work to figure out why, assuming she ever did. I'm sorry. Sasha barely glanced at Marcy. Why? For texting you so late. Her voice was shaky. Sasha only shrugged. I texted you last time, so it's like being even. Marcy fell silent. Was that the wrong thing to say? Sasha supposed she wasn't exactly the best when it came to words. But then, what was she supposed to say? Oh. Marcy's voice snapped Sasha out of her stupor. They were back at the park. Huh. It wasn't the worst place to be. The pair quickly found themselves on the swings again. Marcy rocked herself back and forth slowly. Sasha pressed her lips together, taking one glance at the sky, and took a deep breath. She'd have to make the first move. She paused, noting Marcy had flinched slightly, turning slightly to Sasha to try and play it off. The blonde pretended not to notice. Did you know that most stars we see are bigger and brighter than our sun? In all honesty, Marcy probably knew that, and more, but Sasha was trying. Apparently her friend had noticed, if the small smile said anything. Yeah, her voice was raspy, but her eyes sparkled a little more. And on a good night, we can see 19 quadrillion miles into the sky. Sasha's eyes widened. That's a lot. Marcy nodded, eyes shimmering with tears as she shook slightly. Most stars are also alone. A breath shuddered Marcy's body. Like each of us. Like me. Sasha froze as Marcy dissolved into sobs. Alone? But they're just 12. Isn't that too early to have a crisis? The blonde got off her swing and stood in front of Marcy, one hand on each shoulder. What happened, Marbles? Marcy hiccuped, but kept crying. Her friend kept looking like she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Sasha only nodded, before wrapping the girl in a hug. As Marcy cried, Sasha ran a hand through her hair. She's not great with words, but she'll stay for her. With her. Enough time passed that Sasha's legs were long past burning, but she refused to move, even if she was going to regret it later. Marcy's head moved closer to her neck, snuggling in as her breathing slowed. Sasha froze. She did not. Slowly, Sasha moved back, careful with Marcy, to see her friend had cried herself to sleep. She did. The blonde took a deep breath. She couldn't do words, but she could probably carry her friend back home. How hard could that be? Evidently, very. By the time Sasha made it to Marcy's house, the blonde was ready to drop. She really should have considered the fact that her feet were beyond burning before she even started the trek. Now they were melting. Sasha leaned slightly against the tree, struggling to breathe as sweat rolled down her back. Marcy was still asleep, of course. Sasha moved away from the tree, standing a bit taller with the final stretch. Well, at least all she had to do was... Sasha glanced up at the window above. Get Marcy into her room. The blonde glared at the window, willing it to come closer. It didn't. Fuck. Sasha glanced between Marcy, the tree, and the window. She could probably do it. Maybe. Sasha took one step onto the trunk. Her other leg began buckling. So, waking Marcy it is. One disaster tree climb with the sleepy Marcy later, and Sasha just pulled out the last leaf from Marcy's hair. Her friend snuggled deeper into the blankets. The blonde began to head for the window, content that Marcy was back, but something was still bothering her. What Marcy had said. That stars were alone. Sasha glanced at Marcy's computer. The blonde quickly turned it on, took a second to guess the password, which was much easier than it should have been, and looked up what she needed. As Sasha started going through the window, she glanced at the sticky note on Marcy's notebook. She'd refused if asked it was her, even if it was her writing and something only she would know to write. That didn't change a thing. One hop later, and Sasha walked away, smiling as she looked at the stars. Sure, these interactions were weird, especially since they don't do feelings. But they were also nice. All stars alone? Some stars belong to a cluster. Check the fact. It's true. Anne and I are your cluster, so you're not as alone as you think. Marcy sighed as she laid on her bed, fiddling mindlessly with the Rubik's Cube she had solved more times than she can count. Sasha had texted her earlier that day to sneak out and look at the stars, but she had to decline. Being grounded for getting caught really sucked. They were doing really well for the past few weeks, too. It was only this last time she had got caught, cursing as she had finally fallen from the tree. Honestly, she figured it was a miracle they hadn't been caught already. Marcy groaned as she rolled over, throwing the cube to the floor as her hand patted around her bedside table, finally finding her notebook. She quickly leaned up, flipping open the cover to see a sticky note that had been taped on. All stars alone? Some stars belong to a cluster. Check the fact. It's true. Anne and I are your cluster, so you're not as alone as you think. Marcy smiled, eyes softening at the writing. She doesn't know when, though it's safe to assume when she had fallen asleep from crying, but the small note had been visited more often than she cared to admit. She really wishes she could see the stars tonight with Sasha, but that wasn't going to happen for another week. She slowly sat up, placing the book down. Maybe she could just try looking from out the window? Would that work? Her gaze moved to the glass pane, only to wrestle down a scream as she made eye contact with Sasha, who was just about to knock on the window. Instead, the blonde smiled and waved. Marcy only glared as she tried to steady her breathing, slowing down her racing heart. She quickly stomped over to Sasha, who was remarkably balancing on the branch and leaning on the house. Damn, tall people. Marcy quietly swung the window open, ignoring the breeze. "What's wrong with you?" Marcy hissed, noting Sasha in basketball shorts and a t-shirt. The seasons changing made the night warmer. Sasha just shrugged with a smile playing on her lips as she sat on the branch. Being grounded doesn't mean you get to escape our nightly hangouts. Marcy rolled her eyes, tensing slightly as Sasha looked a little more guilty. Besides, I missed you. She grinned as Sasha's cheeks flared, eyes looking everywhere but her. Not that I care. Were you hurt when you fell? Nope. Marcy popped her pea, letting Sasha off the hook. Just some small cuts and a bruise. Nothing big. Sasha only nodded as Marcy grew antsy, standing in place. So, why'd you come? Figured we could look at the stars from here. Sure, it's not as free as we wish, and we have to keep our voices low, but it's better than nothing. Marcy smiled as she felt her heart swell a little more. Okay. Besides, it wouldn't be the same without my cluster buddy. Sasha's face twisted with confusion. For a moment, she was lost, before her eyes widened and a smile grew on her face. Exactly! Shit. Almost immediately, Marcy slammed her window shut as her door swung open. Her dad stood there, eyes narrowing at seeing her stand there. Who are you talking to? No one. I thought. Her dad's eyes trailed around the room. I thought I heard Sasha. Marcy willed Sasha not to make a noise. It's just me. Why are you by the window? Marcy shrugged. Just wanted to look at the stars. Move. Marcy silently, or as silently as she could, clicked the lock back into place behind her, trying to telepathically warn Sasha to hide. Now. Marcy quickly moved out of the way as her dad surged forward. The tree was empty. Her dad unlocked and slid the window open, leaning out. He was practically leaving that way. After a few seconds of not seeing anything, he leaned back, re-entering the room as he stood tall. Give me your phone. She grabbed her phone and quickly handed it over. He seemed more content with it in his hand. Go to bed. Marcy nodded as he shut the window and walked to the door, nearly closing the door before stopping and wishing her good night. The door shut. She waited a few moments before glancing back at the window. Sasha was already back on the branch. Marcy ran back over to the window, sliding it open. You need to be quiet. Sasha smiled apologetically and nodded, her tone lowering. Still want to look at the stars? Marcy glanced at the door. He shouldn't be coming back. She smiled. Yeah. The blonde grinned, getting a little more comfortable as she picked at some leaves, crumbling them in her hands as she glanced up. Is that a green star? Without even looking, Marcy replied. There's no such thing as a green star. Sasha turned to Marcy. No? Marcy shook her head. Nope. The most you can say is our sun, but that's a blue-green star. Sasha just stared at her blankly. Isn't it yellow? No, that's just the color mixing in our eyes seeing it that way. Sasha didn't look convinced. Marcy smiled. Check the fact. It's true. Yeah. For a moment they were silent, until Sasha grinned. Did you hear about Miss Kieran? She got hit by a car. What? The pair stayed up talking until sunrise. Sasha stopped rambling at some point, content with the silence as she stayed in the tree, leaning on the trunk in case Marcy's dad walked back in. Marcy herself doodled in her notebook. The sky, the tree, Sasha, anything and everything on her mind. And so what if Marcy wasn't out with Sasha, being loud and free? They were together, and the stars were there, and that's enough. At least, until they both nearly had a heart attack as Marcy's alarm went off, snapping Marcy out of her mind and reminding Sasha she needed to run back home. The blonde rolled out of the tree as Marcy shut the window and did her best impression of having barely woken up. They were definitely sleeping in class today. Sasha frowned at the sky. There were hardly any stars out the one day she and Marcy were allowed to stay out late. The universe apparently has a sense of humor. It was the day after her birthday. They had a big party and everyone that mattered was there, but tonight was just for them. The pair laid on a thin blanket in her backyard, Sasha wearing a skirt and a t-shirt while Marcy wore an overall and sweatshirt. I wish there were more stars out, Sasha mumbled. Technically, they are still there. The light pollution is just blocking them out of our sight. Sasha raised a brow. Any way to get rid of it? Changing your lifestyle. Any way to get rid of it in the next 5 minutes? Nope. Wow, thanks. Sasha didn't need to look over to know that Marcy was smiling. For a moment they fell silent, eyes trailing through the sky. Sasha tried counting how many stars there were. Couldn't be more than 50. Want to know a fun fact? The blonde hummed. Stars don't twinkle. Sasha rolled onto her side so fast she was pretty sure her stomach was still back there. What do you mean they don't twinkle? Marcy grinned as she faced Sasha. They don't twinkle. Then what the hell is the point of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star? Sasha watched Marcy shake her head. They don't twinkle. They emit. So why do we say that they twinkle? Marcy shrugged. Maybe it's because it's catchier. Marcy grinned, trying to fight down a laugh as she took on a singing tune. Emit, emit, ball of gas. Sasha punched Marcy's arm. Stop it! Her friend began cackling. You need to shut up and enjoy 5 stars out with me. Marcy laughed harder, borderline snorting. Sasha rolled onto her back, wrestling down her own smile as Marcy quieted down. The blonde finally schooled her features, only to hear something in her mind. Emit, emit, ball of gas. Oh no. Emit, emit, ball of gas. No. Emit, emit, ball of gas. I hate you so much. Marcy stared at Sasha, confused. That one line is stuck in my head now, Sasha clarified. Her friend began a whole new round of giggles, mumbling more of the song under her breath, much to Sasha's distaste. After a minute, the pair had fallen into another round of silence. Sasha glared at the sky, mentally demanding more stars to come out. What if we made our own constellations? Sasha pursed her lips. It wouldn't be such a bad idea, even if she would have no idea how to do that. Sure, okay. Marcy shot up to a sitting position so fast Sasha got whiplash. Really? Sasha shrugged. I don't see why not. And even if this might be stupid, it wouldn't be so bad with the smile on her friend's face. So, I think yours should have 13 stars since you're 13 now, and mine can have 12 since I'm still 12. Marcy stared at Sasha, slightly wary. If that's alright. Sasha grinned. Of course, Marbles. Okay, cool. Marcy took her notebook out of seemingly nowhere. I need you to give me the pose that you want. Sasha took a moment to think. Did she want to look like herself? Take a chance to look like a soldier? Pose like a creature? Like a queen? Yes. The blonde smirked as she climbed to her feet, quickly striking a pose of a high ruler, standing tall with reputation and looking down on her subjects. Marcy smiled, sketching quickly. What are you supposed to be? A ruler of the sky. You may call me... Sasha paused long enough to throw her hair around in the most overly dramatic, flourishing way possible, borderline cracking her own neck. Finally, she stopped. Queen of the universe. Marcy's eyes held amusement as her pencil stopped moving. Then what do you think, Your Highness? Sasha tried her best elegant plop as she sat beside Marcy, looking inside the journal. There was Sasha, in gleaming armor, with a sword in her hands, face down. A crown rested on her head, 3 stars at the center of the headpiece, and her chest plate, with a single one at the center of the handle of her sword. Sasha grinned. It's good. Where would the stars go? One at the top of the crown, one at each side, one at the center of your chest plate, one where your hands hold the blade, one at the sword's end, one at each elbow and shoulders, one for each eye, and the last star on the sword's handle. Sasha counted her fingers off as Marcy listed them all. Wow, you managed to use all 13 stars. Marcy nodded. And, since they're so vague and not planned on actual star maps, we can make you anywhere, even on nights like these. The blonde focused back on the sky. It was true. She could make Queen of the Universe anywhere, even on a night like this. So now, Marcy's tone was soft, you'll always be up there, just like how the stars would be. Sasha's breath hitched. You need to be up there too. For a moment they debated, but Marcy wanted to be a 12-star butterfly called Rofalocera. Sasha agreed to it, but they both knew she would forget the name. She decided to remember how it's formed, and she'd call it Marbles. She smiles at Marcy. See? Now you're there too. Her friend nodded. Now we can be together on nights we can't be in person. Sasha smiled and nodded, glancing back at the sky, making their constellations over and over in the sky. The best ones that aren't even limited by positions in the sky. Queen of the Universe and Rafo Marbles. Marcy watched as Sasha flinched at the thunder. Tonight there would be no stargazing, not with the raging dry storm outside. I don't see why it can't rain. We already have thunder and lightning, and everyone knows how much water we need in SoCal. Marcy hummed at Sasha's grumbling. It was true, and normally Marcy would keep commenting on that stuff, but the blonde was honestly freaked out by the storm. She could tell by the way that Sasha's hands were shaking. What should she do? Marcy glanced around the room. The pair had moved into the couch in the garage. Normally they would be in her room, but it was closer to the thunder, something Sasha didn't want right now. The garage had a beanbag, the TV, some games. Do you want to play a game? Sasha sent a half-hearted glare at her. Guess that was a no then. The blonde flinched at another rumble. Maybe they just needed to drown out the noise? Marcy glanced at her drum kit. That would be enough, but Sasha didn't have her guitar, so she wouldn't be distracted. not really. Maybe she should just hug her? Would that be enough to remind her friend that she was here as the storm raged on? Sasha curled a bit more on herself, arms pulling her knees closer to her chest. She looked so small. Marcy bit her lip as she glanced at the room again, willing something to stand out. At the very least, she should call Anne, but that would mean ending these relaxing nights. Not that it was very relaxing now. Marcy glanced at Sasha. If it helped her friend, shouldn't she call Anne? She sighed as she climbed to her feet, rubbing one of Sasha's hands before moving over to the door. It's fine. Marcy sent a smile to Sasha, only to spot a giant block behind her. What was that? Before she could even think about it, Marcy made her way over to take a closer look. It was a stereo. Marcy grinned. Hey, Sasha. She turned her attention to the blonde, confusion winning over fear for a moment. Yeah? How much do you not want to hear the thunder? Sasha's face looked even more confused before she glanced at the stereo. That looks older than time itself. Are you sure that's a good idea? Of course. Marcy smiled as she tugged out her friend. My parents aren't home, and if they call, it'll interrupt the music, so we'll be able to hear it. The blonde let go of her knees as she leaned forward. That's good. Great. Now I'm going to need a cable. Marcy got cut off by another clap of thunder. Sasha's hands slammed over her ears. All right then. Marcy quickly grabbed the cable and checked the stereo. Sasha wasn't wrong. This thing was battery operated. One new set of batteries and cable checks, and they were ready. Marcy quickly pulled up her playlists on her phone. Some K-pop, J-pop, anime, rock, pop, and alternative. She scrolled past all of them and smiled at a playlist that she hadn't used in a long time. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Sasha was curled into a ball again. Marcy checked everything one last time and raised the volume, hitting play as the unmistakable sound of a whistle began. Sasha barked out a laugh as the music continued on. Don't worry, be happy. Marcy nodded as she raised the volume, overpowering the storm outside. Sasha rolled her eyes. A little on the nose, don't you think? Maybe. Marcy began as she danced her way over to Sasha, offering a hand as she sang a line. Don't worry. Sasha snorted, taking her hand. Be happy. The rest of the night was spent giggling, dancing, and singing to other classics. By the time they finally looped, the storm was long gone. Marcy collapsed on the couch, giggling, as Sasha laid next to her. Both girls held hands as Sasha played with her fingers. We need to put on more current music than that. Nah, Marcy said as she unplugged her phone and turned off the stereo with her free hand. I think how outdated it is makes it more charming. Sasha snorted. Loser. Marcy softly shoved her. Dork. Both girls were slowly falling asleep on the couch. Marcy knew they were going to regret it, but it felt so nice and comfortable, she couldn't bring herself to care. Slowly, her eyes fell closed, breathing slowly, hearing Sasha's mumble before being taken by sleep. Thank you. Sasha grinned at Marcy. The two were sitting on the swings as they looked up at the stars. There were a fair amount tonight. Are you ready for Anne's birthday in about a week? Of course, Sasha smiled. It'll be a blast for her. Marcy just sighed. I hope so. I don't even have a present ready for her. Sasha just shrugged, offering the smallest huff. You'll think of something, Marbles. You always do. The blonde shut her eyes as she slowly rocked back and forth. She hoped she wouldn't be too controlling on Anne's birthday. She was becoming more and more mean, but she didn't know how to stop. She'd figure out how to stop before it got worse, right? She didn't want to hurt her girls. I still think I can swing higher than you. Sasha's eyes snapped open, turning to Marcy. She had a smile on her face, but concern in her eyes. She must have noticed the change of mood. Sasha's mouth turned up in a smile, ignoring the voice at the back of her mind insisting that Marcy was too observant. "Oh, please," she playfully scoffed. "I'm a cheerleader, built for sport. You're just a nerd." Marcy's eyes blew wide, mocking an offended look. Concern gone. Nice. Instead of a response, Marcy began kicking back and forth on the swing. Sasha snickered as she began to move as well. For a moment, the blonde forgot all her worries. The only thing on her mind was trying to get higher than Marcy, to get closer to the stars. She took a quick glance at her friend. They were at the same height, nearly upside down, but her friend was huffing. Sure, they reached the same height, but she could outlast Marcy. "Tired already?" Sasha teased. Marcy opened her mouth to respond, but only huffed. Sasha laughed. "Can't even speak." Marcy pouted, sounding like she just ran up a mountain. "Well, I don't throw people after school every day." Sasha laughed harder. She couldn't help it. Nights like these were the only times she felt safe enough to not be so controlling. The blonde glanced at Marcy. Her friend had a soft look on her face. Sasha raised a brow. "What are you looking at?" "Why don't you smile more?" Sasha froze as Marcy ducked her head. Sorry, forget I asked." Should she answer? Could she tell Marcy why she was so controlling? What would she say? What would she think? "Do you," Marcy weakly began, "do you think this is the closest we'll ever be to the stars? On a swing?" "No." Sasha was surprised at how resolved her voice was. "Rides we've been on go higher, and planes go higher than that. Not to mention..." Sasha paused to look Marcy in the eyes, trying to silently thank her for the change of subject. "We're already in the stars." Marcy looked confused as Sasha smiled. "Well, our constellations are." Sasha raised a hand, turning her attention up, connecting the stars to draw a butterfly in the sky with her finger. "See? There you are." She could hear the shakiness in Marcy's voice as she spoke. "That's true." "See?" Sasha grinned, finally noticing that the swing was only barely moving. "The stars are always there, like we are." Marcy smiled. "Our own little cluster." "Exactly." Marcy let out a slow breath as she stared at the sky, a smile on her face. The nights and stars were different in Amphibia. "What are you thinking about?" Marcy turned her attention to King Andreas. The pair were sitting outside on a balcony, stargazing. "The stars. They're different in my world." Marcy's face twisted into a look of contemplation as she looked at the formations. "We have constellations, which are kind of images in the sky that can't be seen here." Andreas hummed. "That's interesting." Marcy's smile widened. "Right? I know all kinds of facts about them and can point them out, but no one really paid attention to me besides Sasha. We'd..." Marcy's enthusiasm melted away as her smile dropped. "We'd look at the stars together all the time." Marcy could feel the king staring at her, but she paid him no mind, bringing her hands closer around herself. She missed those late nights. They were always nice, especially since she got to see the real Sasha. "Are you okay?" Marcy contemplated Andreas' question. Normally she'd lie, but she's already told him so much. It couldn't hurt to confide in him a little more. She stared into his eyes, trying to spot any malicious intent or any uninterest. There was none. Just understanding and kindness. An invitation to trust him. "No," Marcy began. "It's been a few months, but I still haven't heard from either of my friends." The new king nodded his head. "I imagine it must be hard to not know." Marcy nodded her head. It was hard. What if they're in trouble, or hurt somewhere, or lost, or waiting for her? They're fine. Marcy's head shot up in shock as she stared at Andreas with wide eyes. How'd he know? He was just answering her unasked questions like nothing. Amphibia is a good place. They are safe, and will eventually find their way here. Marcy frowned. She wasn't entirely wrapped around in that idea, but he was the king. He'd know his kingdom better than she ever would. Okay. Andrea smiled. How about you tell me about the stars? Are you sure? Andrea smiled and nodded with his head. I like all the information, you know. Distantly, Marcy noted how weird that was phrased, but she pushed it away. He was a kind ruler. He wouldn't harm her or anyone else. Marcy launched into a ramble about the stars in the sky, word-vomiting anything and everything she knew to the kind king. Andrews, for his part, never once tuned her out. He held on to everything she was saying with intent. It was a little refreshing. Her parents never listened to her. Anne meant well, but couldn't keep up. And Sasha tuned her out if it wasn't a stargazing night. To have someone listen to her, like, really listen, was different. It was nice. Especially from someone who meant so much to her. By the time she fell silent, the moon was already halfway across the sky. That was all pretty interesting, Marcy. Marcy smiled. Yeah, one time Sasha did some research too. Andres' eyebrow raised. Really? She nodded her head. Yeah, look. Marcy quickly reached into her bag, tugging out her worn notebook, flipping open the cover to see the small note taped inside. The ink would have faded, but Marcy had traced it over, careful not to ruin Sasha's handwriting. She wrote this to me when I was sad. Andres glanced down at the note, reading it aloud. All stars alone? Some stars belong to a cluster. Check the fact. It's true. Anne and I are your cluster, so you're not as alone as you think. Marcy nodded her head to confirm the fact was true. The king handed her the book back. How interesting. Are you too close? Yes. Marcy smiled, tucking the book back into her bag. It may not seem that way, but we are friends. Andreas nodded his head before putting on his best puppy eyes. Are we close, Marcy? Marcy laughed at the king's antics. Yes, I'd say we are. Then, Andreas began. May I give you a nickname? Marcy perked up, motioning for him to go on. How about Shooting Star, for the balls of gas you love so much? Marcy snickered before looking a little uncomfortable. He wouldn't mind, right? What's wrong? That's right. He was pretty good at reading people. Marcy curled in on herself, voice coming out a bit meekly. You don't mind if I decline? Something flashed in his eyes. Before she could think of it, her mouth rambled. It's okay if it's not. It's just that the stars are a thing between me and Sasha. I just told you about it since this reminded me of her. I really shouldn't have even brought it. Hey. Andrews cut her off. Marcy tried not to wilt in place. She started this. She had to see it through, no matter what he chose to say. It's okay. I'll just keep calling you Marcy. Marcy pouted. She still felt bad. She should make it up to him. Maybe provide a different nickname? Anything with stars was off the table. That's between her and Sasha. Name-calling wasn't much of an option either, since those were more general. Marbles? No, that's a name between her and Anne. Only Sasha and Anne can use it. What was left? Marmar. Andreas looked confused. Marcy cleared her throat as she clarified. You can call me Marmar. The king's eyes lit up, a wide smile on his face. Delightful! Marmar! Marcy smiled. Yeah. For a moment, the pair fell silent, save for the king chuckling to himself. Marcy's eyes slowly drooped. The sky was really pretty for here. Everything was. It was a peaceful world, one that made her forget everything she had left behind. It was a kind of peace she probably wouldn't find anywhere else. Marmar? Marcy hummed as she turned to the king. Andrews looked a little antsy. The concern woke her up as she focused all her attention on the newt. I know Sasha and Anne are friends to you, but what am I? Marcy pondered the question. What was he to her? He wasn't just anyone. He looked after her, taking care of her, gave her a place to sleep, made sure she was fed, listened to her rambles, and so much more. Would that make him her? Marcy's eyes widened at the realization. She turned her attention to Andreas. The newt sat patiently. He deserved to know. This might not make sense, and if you want, I could stop, but... The king waited patiently as she tried mustering up some courage. He really was too good for her. I kind of see you as sort of like a father figure. Andreas' mouth fell open. Marcy watched him freeze, slowly becoming a bit more antsy as her fingers drummed on her leg. Andreas? His boisterous laugh rang out, startling her for a moment as he shot to his feet. How delightful! Why, Marmar, I see you as the daughter I never had. It was Marcy's turn to have a jaw drop. Her eyes widened as she stared at the king. He saw her as the daughter he never had? That was more than she could process. Really? Her mouth disagreed. Andreas nodded his head. Of course. Marcy shot straight to her feet, smiling so wide her face could probably snap in half. That's crazy. Andreas laughed again. Well, since we are on the same page, may I make you a promise? Marcy nodded her head. It took everything in her not to jump around. The king lowered himself to one knee in front of her. He raised a hand over his chest. I swear to always protect you, to never let any harm come over you, and to help you find your friends. It was a courtesy as you were my chief ranger, but now it is an honor as you are like a daughter. Marcy wasted no time running into his chest, giving the best hug she could, mumbling thank yous over and over. Coming here was the best decision ever. Eventually they'd tell the other newts and figure out if they wanted to make it official. The amount of paperwork and talking for that would be insufferable. But for the moment, she was just happy to let the moment sink in. Andreas hugged her back, and it couldn't feel more right. It felt safe, in a way home never has. This had to be what having a real dad was like, right? It was kind of like hanging out with Mr. B, but better. She sent a small glance at the stars. Sure, they weren't doing much here, but as she made Queen of the Universe in the sky, she could pretend it was like Sasha knew too. Like Sasha was here, giving her approval, being happy for her too. She couldn't wait to actually tell her. Sasha couldn't believe this was happening. The three of them were together again. Anne, Marcy, and her. All reunited. Sure, she was going to betray them, but if she just ignored that and the whole other world part, it was almost like things were normal again. Sasha. The blonde turned her attention to Grime. The toad didn't look super pleased, but he was struggling to keep up the nice guy act. She thought he'd be a little better after the volcano battle. What's up? Before you go to your little... Grime paused for a moment, looking like he was trying to swallow a rock. Sleep over. His tone hardened. Do remember what we are here for. Sasha rolled her eyes. Of course, Grimesy. The plan hasn't changed, and neither have I. The toad offered no response, just walking away. Sasha took that as her leave, glancing down at her pajamas. Tonight she was having a sleepover with Marcy. Anne had declined to spend more time with that fake frog family of hers, and she probably still didn't trust her. Sasha stepped out the door, eyes glued to the ground as she mulled over her words. The plan hadn't changed. That was true. But her feelings have. It has to be done. They have to overthrow the king. She just hoped her girls wouldn't get hurt in the process. Sasha? The blonde's head shot up, staring at Marcy as she stood in her doorway. Her friend wore a t-shirt with sweatpants. When did she walk over? You okay? Sasha pasted a smile on her face. Yeah, totally. Marcy didn't look convinced. Come on, let's go inside. Sasha began, taking a step forward when Marcy grabbed her hand. No, let's do something else. Marcy grinned. Let me lead you. Don't look at the sky, please. The blonde looked confused, but shrugged. Okay, Sasha smiled. If you walk me into something, I will not hesitate to hurt you. Marcy laughed and began leading her. It took everything in Sasha not to look up. Trusting Marcy wasn't the problem. Hell, even trusting Anne wasn't hard. The world was the difficulty. Sure, she could take care of herself, and her girls can watch themselves. But this place was dangerous. There were just too many predators, too many risks that couldn't be predicted. Especially in the wild. Okay, sit down. Sasha plopped down, Marcy sitting next to her. The blonde glanced around, careful not to look up. They were on a hill of some kind, a fair walk away from Mortwood. You can look up now. Sasha's eyes glanced up, and she felt floored. The sky had so many more stars. At home, a good night had about 20 stars. Bad ones had 3. But here there were more than she could ever hope to count. The stars covering as much of the sky as she could see. The sky itself was also covered in an assortment of colors. Blues, purples, reds, and greens. It was so much more than she could have ever imagined. How did she spend so long and never once know that the sky was this beautiful? Wow. Marcy snorted. Apparently that comment came from her. Sasha didn't even have the heart to glare as she kept her eyes up in the sky. Has this view always been here? Yeah. Sasha looked back at Marcy. The girl smiled. It's really pretty, right? Sasha nodded, turning back to the sky. It was a really pretty sight. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Marcy tracing the sky in a pattern. The blonde snorted at her friend. You need to draw the simpler but better one, Sasha teased. For a moment, Marcy looked confused, so Sasha traced a butterfly in the sky, connecting the proper stars. You remembered? Sasha grinned, looking at Marcy's shocked face. Of course! Can't forget about my cluster and all that. Marcy's face turned to a smile. Did you know the stars operate a bit differently here? Sasha shook her head, settling down a bit more comfortably as Marcy began yet another huge ramble. She missed this. She really did. And sure, she wasn't really paying much attention, but this world wasn't very forgiving. Besides, it was probably enough that she was here with Marcy. Her friend probably didn't even notice in her rambles, wrapped up in her own world and all. Sash? The blonde checked back in to look at Marcy. Her friend looked hurt. What's wrong? Marcy pouted. If you don't want to listen, I can just stop. I'm listening, Sasha said. Marcy just looked away. You don't need to lie. Sasha glared. I'm not lying. Fine, Marcy glared back. That was a bit surprising. Tell me one thing I told you. Just one. Sasha drew a blank, struggling to come up with something. Could she lie? Would that work? What would she even say? It's fine, Marcy said, standing up. Sasha racked her brain for something, anything, as Marcy started walking away. I'm heading back. Oh no. She didn't want to be alone. Stars, stars, stars. Please. Anything. Did Grime ever mention them? Marcy was a few steps away now. Please. She couldn't ruin this night. What could she say? Stars! Sasha shouted, ignoring the urge to look around as Marcy turned to face her, a sad look on her face. The blonde tried to ignore how much her heart twisted at that. You mentioned that the newts study them to track stuff, right? Marcy nodded. Holy shit, she just made that up. But did you know that toads also use them to figure out where the towers are? Marcy looked intrigued. Sasha was pleased that the sad look was gone. How? The blonde patted the empty space next to her, a silent invitation. Sasha tried to plead with her eyes, all but begging Marcy to come back. And she did. Well, they're toads, so I'm sure their explanation may not be as eloquent as the newts would speak. Sasha tried to ignore how much her face must have lit up at Marcy's snort. But I can try to regale you with their methods. Sasha got a real laugh from that. For the rest of the night, she rambled on and on about the toads, her time with them, and the stars themselves. Do you think this is what our sky would look like if there wasn't so much light pollution? I'm not sure. Marcy hummed in response. Sure, she has seen pictures of the night sky in the forests, but without any light pollution at all, that wasn't anything she had seen, at least back on Earth. Amphibia seemed to be the exception in a lot of cases. Tonight the stars weren't out as much, though that was more to blame on the storm clouds rather than the amphibians' lifestyles. They had just finished the Battle of the Bands a few hours ago. Now the pair were outside, sitting in the town square. Well, Sasha began. Marcy turned her attention to her friend. What was she planning? Tell you what. The blonde sat up, something Marcy couldn't place shining in her eyes. When we all get back, we'll take some big trip one day to some forest and look at the sky. You can tell me where, and I'll take us. Marcy felt her jaw drop and eyes widen. Really? Sasha nodded her head, but Marcy barreled on, thinking of the possibilities. We can go somewhere and see the stars in their full glory, out in some forest. What would be the best one? Maybe the Grand Canyon? I hear they have a really beautiful sky, but the storms can get kind of crazy, and it's really hot there. Oh, but there's also the Sequoia National Park. The trees are so big there and reach higher than anything else. Will we even be able to see the stars well? Oh, there's also the Yosemite National Park, but... Dear God, Marvels. Marcy snapped out of her thoughts as Sasha looked at her amused. It's gonna be a while, so maybe relax. Even when we leave, whenever that is, we have to wait for us to be old enough. Marcy shot a smile at her. You're right. Sorry. Sasha snorted, rolling her eyes. It's fine. Good to know you're excited, though. Of course. Did you feel that? Marcy raised a hand out in front of her. Another drop fell on her palm. Then another, and another. And it's raining! Sasha exclaimed, glancing up at the sky. The drops quickly turned into a full-on pour. Marcy laughed as she looked around. That's amazing! It doesn't ever really rain at home, especially this fast. Sasha nodded before glancing down at the ground. Marcy followed her gaze. Puddles were already forming. Marcy grinned as she ran to the nearest puddle and stomped her feet in it. Marcy watched as the blonde snickered. Despite the rain, she looked a little too dry, in Marcy's opinion. Hey! Marcy called Sasha over, trying to be as innocent as she could. Check this out! Marcy motioned Sasha over, pointing at the puddle. Sasha raised a brow before shaking her head and moving closer, not suspecting anything. Sasha stepped forward, the blonde glancing down. What am I supposed to see? This. Without any more warning, Marcy kicked her foot out, sending a small wave from the puddle that splashed onto Sasha's boots and legs. Sasha tried to move out of the way, but slipped over the mud, landing in a heap on the floor as Marcy laughed. She didn't expect it to work that well. Marcy! Marcy flinched at Sasha's shout, her friend's glare willing her to wilt into the floor, only for the look to vanish. Her friend had an evil smile as her tone became sweet. You've got 3 seconds. She didn't need to be told twice. Marcy pivoted on her heel to sprint away as Sasha began to count, only for her ankle to decide that she must die, landing in the puddle herself. Hearing Sasha laugh made the tension in her shoulders vanish. Marcy smiled. Does this make us even? Sasha's smile became more wicked. Not by a long shot, traitor. Marcy pouted as she glared. Well, I'm not going down. I believe. Sasha cut her off as she stood up. You are already down. I'm not going down, Marcy began again, ignoring Sasha's snort. Without a fight, Lieutenant. For the next 2 hours, the pair played in the rain, kicking water at each other and wrestling in the mud. Even after the rain had stopped, they were still outside, giggling, laying on the ground since they were already covered in filth. Marcy took a deep breath, only to wrinkle her nose. You smell. Sasha's jaw dropped. And you smell better? Well, I don't have a stench like you. Sasha looked even more offended. I have an aroma. Marcy, what the fuck? Anne would later find them outside, and they would have a small cold. But for now, Marcy felt so free and happy. If they were having this much fun in Amphibia, she couldn't wait to see how much fun they would have in other worlds. Dear God, no. Did that really happen? I mean, she saw it with her own eyes, so it must have actually happened. There's no way she could have imagined that. No way she'd want to. But could she really handle Marcy dying? Was that even allowed? Sure, Marcy had played them, but she tried to make it right. They were only 13. Wasn't there some rule against killing kids? She couldn't be gone. It had been a few days since she and Grime escaped from the castle, but that didn't change what she saw. The fact that every night she gets scared awake with her mind replaying Marcy's death over and over, forcing herself to relive it, to try and figure out if she could have done something different, could have saved her if only she had been a little faster, smarter, stronger. But she wasn't, and never would be. It didn't help that she couldn't even bring herself to mention what happened to Marcy to the townspeople. What would she even say? Hey, the king's evil, and we know this because he killed Marcy. Anyway, let's go fight him. What could go wrong? Sasha's throat tightened. What was she gonna do? Sasha, are you okay? The blonde sent a blank look to Grime, trying her hardest not to look like she was 2 seconds from crying. Sure, Grimesy. The toad smiled, obviously happy he wouldn't have to deal with feelings. Well, have a good night. She watched him leave, Grime humming with every step as he took to Hop Hop's room. Sasha let out a deep breath. It was shaky, and not nearly enough to get rid of the tension in her body. What was she gonna do? Her arms wrapped around herself. Was there really anything she could do? This would be easier if Anne was here, even if she was pissed off with her. At least, according to the last time she saw her friend. Were they even friends? Sasha wilted in on herself. Did she even deserve any friends? All she did was betray them. Even when they were on the same side, she couldn't protect them. Marcy was proof enough of that. Otherwise, she'd still be alive. Sasha screwed her eyes shut. She can't do that. Not that route. What would Anne do? Well, she would probably go declare war on the king with her new powers. She didn't have that, so that was out. Marcy? Her breath hitched. Maybe she shouldn't ponder the future with her. Then again, Most of her relaxing memories come from Marcy when they would stargaze. That's it. Sasha opened her eyes, letting her arms fall as she walked to the door, twisting the knob and stepping outside. In a minute, she was on the same hill that the pair would lay on to look at the stars. She glanced around her, only grass in sight. It felt weird without Marcy. Now we can be together on nights we can't be in person. Sasha flinched at the memory, Marcy's voice ringing in her mind. Glancing at the stars as she quickly lined up 12 of them, drawing a butterfly into the sky with her finger. You'll always be there, just like how the stars would be. Sasha couldn't help sniffling as she tried to choke down a sob, tracing a few more into the sky with a shaky finger. For a while, this was the closest she could be to Marcy, drawing her friend into the sky. She'll save her. She wasn't dead. She wasn't allowed to be. She'd save her, and then they could all be together again. And when she saved her, they'd go stargazing more. Sasha wouldn't ever let her go again. She'd share more late-night talks, and they'd go stargazing in all the forests Marcy wanted. Because she'd be there, and she'd be alive, and everything would be okay again. Sasha's arms found their way around her again. Tears fell from her eyes rapidly. She didn't bother trying to wipe them away. Sasha took a shaky breath. They always talk during these times. She just had to pretend Marcy was listening. Yeah, she was there listening. Just doodling in her notebook, or writing notes, or whatever, instead of talking. Marcy is here with her. Was here. Hey, Marbles. Sasha couldn't stop her hiccups, or the shaky breath, as she tried to ignore her thoughts. Did you know that I pay attention to everything you say? A whimper made it past her lips. Like how if you look in the sky, you're seeing 19 quadrillion miles into space? She let out a little cry. Or how there's no such thing as a green star. Sasha was downright sobbing now, struggling to breathe and speak, but she had to keep going. And how stars don't twinkle. They emit. Sasha shut her eyes, curling into a smaller ball. And how some come in clusters. Sasha glanced at the stars, squeezing herself tighter as she made hers and Marcy's constellations in the sky. Including us. And we'll save you, okay? I'll save you. You're an important part of this cluster, I promise. And it's not the same without you, okay? Just please be okay. You keep hanging on, and I'll come get you, okay? I promise. Sasha rubbed her nose, shoulders shaking as she willed her message to reach her friend. Stay alive, and I'll come get you, I promise. And when we get you... Sasha paused, thinking about the last words Marcy had said to her. When we get you, you won't be alone, and we can go on as many adventures as you want, I promise. Sasha curled into a tight ball, burying her head in her knees. Please, Marbles, you have to be okay. She wasn't sure how long she had stayed asleep on the hill, but it was long enough that the moon was well across the sky. Her nose felt stuffy, and her eyes were heavy, but the stars were still there, shining down on her with the sky behind it. Sasha let out a small, wet laugh, mumbling to the sky. It's almost like you're watching over me, Marbles. The blonde rubbed at her eyes blearily. I'll come get you, and we can kill the king together. She took a deep breath. I swear. Slowly, Sasha stood from her spot, gazing at the stars one last time before walking back to the frog home, feeling a little better. Time with Marcy always did that. The blonde sent out one last smile at the hill, and if anyone heard her broken humming, she'd deny it. Not that they'd know the song. Emit, emit, ball of gas. Marcy sighed as she leaned on Sasha. The pair were sitting against the tree outside in the park, the stars above them shining in the sky. There were a few more in the park, but it was nothing compared to amphibian skies. Do you ever think about what could have happened? Marcy glanced at Sasha. The blonde stared back at her, a confused look in her eyes. What do you mean? Well, Marcy played with her fingers. Just a month ago we were able to beat Andreas, save everyone, and bring me home. All of that could have easily been undone. What if we messed up? What if Andreas killed you or Anne? What if we couldn't protect Amphibia? What if... Marcy's breath hitched, her tone dropping to a whisper. What if this isn't real? Instantly, Marcy felt Sasha's arms wrapped around her, squeezing her tightly. Marbles, this is real. Marcy shut her eyes, feeling one of Sasha's hands move to her head, fingers trailing through her hair. I promise, this is real. Marcy nodded. Okay. She must have not hid the disbelief in her tone well, because Sasha hugged her tighter than before. Normally it would have been painful, but the contact was keeping her here, in the moment. Even if it wasn't real, it was nice. We're safe, Sasha continued. How can I prove it? Marcy opened her eyes, studying the grass. How could she prove this was real to herself? What would Sasha know, but not the knight? Marcy's face screwed up. Even if there was something the knight would already know. At least, theoretically, since she would have to know to confirm, so then he'd get access to it, assuming he was in control and all. It was already hard enough when the knight would play mind games with her before. Of course, that's assuming he wasn't currently doing that, but there'd be no sure way to know unless she woke up, assuming she could tell the difference between actually waking up and fake waking up. Marcy! Marcy jolted, head snapping up at Sasha, who was holding one hand in each of her own. The blonde looked relieved. Thank Frog you're back. Back? Sasha nodded, still not letting go of her hands. You kind of checked out and started hurting your hands. Marcy looked closer at her hands, but couldn't see much since Sasha still wasn't letting go. Sorry. The blonde sighed. It sounded tired. It's fine. Just be careful. Marcy nodded her head. Sasha finally let her go and laid her down, resting her head on Marcy's lap. Even without thinking, Marcy began running her hand through the blonde's hair. Sasha sighed in content. This is real. Marcy pouted as she glanced up at the stars. And I think I can prove it. Marcy looked at Sasha, confused. Sasha looked pretty confident. If it wasn't, then how would the knight know to make so little stars? Wouldn't he want you to be content and happy by making more stars? Or pick a nicer adventure to be on? Marcy paused. She supposed it makes sense, even if there were a few loops. It was nice to be here. She supposed that whether it was real or not didn't matter. Not right now. Not to mention, Sasha began, the knight was putting you down. Everything worked out. Wouldn't he be bugging you with all the bad stuff? That actually made more sense. Marcy smiled as she took a breath, slouching slightly on the tree. Okay, this is real. Sasha's entire face lit up with a smile, before taking a softer look in her eyes. Anne and I will be here to remind you as many times as you need. Marcy nodded. They'd be here. Always would. Do you have any more facts about the stars? Marcy couldn't hide her surprise. You actually want to know more? Sasha smiled. Of course. Well, she had to think for a second. Did you know that the stars are constantly moving? They're just so far away that we can't notice it. Sasha stared blankly at her before blinking. Okay, now you're just messing with me. Marcy laughed. No, I'm not. They're just too far away that everyone is blind and can't register the movement. Sasha snorted. Pretty sure that could have been worded better. Marcy shrugged. Could have, but then your small brain wouldn't have been able to handle it. Sasha gasped as Marcy snorted. Should I rephrase what I just said? In a flash, the blonde tackled Marcy, tickling her until Marcy had no choice but to shout incoherent apologies between laughter. After the longest 5 minutes, Sasha finally released her friend, both girls dissolving into giggles as they laid on the grass, looking up. Marcy glanced away to look at the clock. It was 2:14 a.m. We should probably head back. Sasha nodded as she stood up. Marcy followed, only for her knees to give out. Spend too much time on your feet? Yeah. Marcy watched her friend sigh before picking her up, piggyback style. Sasha began walking back. Marcy took the time to stare at the stars. Got any other fun facts? The oldest known star is HD 14283, or the Methuselah star. It's 200 light years away and estimated to be 13.5 billion years old. That's really old. I'd really hate to be the one putting candles on that cake. Marcy giggled, beginning to feel tired from Sasha's rocking. You just need a candle that has the word billion, a period, and then the numbers 1, 3, and 5. Then you're all set. Sasha snorted. Leave it to you to find a loophole. Got any more facts? There are about 400 million stars being made each day. That's a lot. Marcy nodded, her eyes drooping as she tried not to fall asleep on Sasha's shoulders. It is. Sasha huffed a laugh. She must have heard how tired she is. It's okay to go to sleep, you know? Marcy shook her head, yawning. No, that's mean. Sasha snorted. No, it's not. Now go ahead and rest. I'll keep you safe. Marcy hummed. The world became foggier as she mumbled. You always do. She never heard Sasha's response, much less remember anything beyond that. The next thing she knew, Marcy was waking up on the couch, Sasha asleep next to her, a blanket thrown on them haphazardly. Marcy slowly shut her eyes again. She can wake up later. She was safe here. So, what are you thinking for today? Sasha watched Marcy shrug. The blonde tried her best not to let her friend's mood get to her, too. It was the day after Marcy's 14th birthday, about 4 months after Amphibia, but the girls were stuck inside Sasha's room due to the rain. Both girls sat on her bed. Her guitar sat in one corner of the room, the amp and a cajon next to it, and her TV sat on her dresser. None of that was on, though, as Sasha watched Marcy fiddle with her fingers. Just a year ago, she'd be scared, but after fighting herons, monster bugs, an evil king, and misguided folk, storms were nothing. Marcy was a little different. Before, Marcy was the brave one, but now her friend was decently checked out. Could the rain be reminding her of her time in the tank? But that didn't make sense. She was fine around water. Thunder rumbled across the sky, lightning flashing outside. Marcy whimpered and slammed her hands over her ears, pushing her palms into her skull. Ah, it was the thunder. Sasha grabbed Marcy's hands, lowering them slowly. Hey, Marbles, what's bothering you about the rain? Her friend's voice came out as a whisper. It sounds like Andres' footsteps. Oh. Well, Sasha glanced around her room, laying her eyes on the amp. Would you like to not hear the thunder? Marcy looked at her weird. Sasha grinned. I do recall a certain playlist with old songs we'd play for these occasions. Sasha's eyes shined a bit brighter as Marcy let out a small laugh. Sure, Sash. The blonde wasted no time as she vaulted over to the amp, grabbing the needed cable to connect her phone. Where was her phone? Sasha's head shot up, glancing along the floor and surfaces of her room. No phone in sight. What are you looking for? My phone. Sasha patted down her pockets, but it wasn't magically appearing. Sasha's attention turned to her friend as Marcy cleared her throat. You left it on the bed. Thanks. One toss later, and Sasha had her phone plugged in. Any requests? The thunder cut off whatever Marcy was going to say, her scared friend going pale. Anything we can dance to? Sasha nodded her head, sending a small glare to the window. This damn storm sucked. Sasha quickly scrolled through the playlist, finding the perfect song. Just as she hit play, the music began, and Marcy's face lit up. Jump in the line? Sasha just snickered in response as she moved over to Marcy, holding a hand out. Don't make me dance to this alone. Marcy smiled, wiping her eyes as she stood and took Sasha's hand. The pair ended up dancing and twirling around to every song on the playlist. When they finished, the storm was still going on, but neither were paying it any attention. They just sat on the ground, dissolving in giggles. Can we do something? Sasha hummed. What did Marcy have in mind? Let's play a song. Sasha rolled over, staring at Marcy. I don't have any drums, though. No, but you do have a cajon, and apparently an acoustic under the bed. Sasha followed Marcy's finger. Huh, she didn't remember having that. So we can do an acoustic version of something. Sasha mulled the thought over. It wasn't a bad idea. Not to mention, it would make a good distraction. Okay. Marcy cheered, shooting up as she moved to grab the brown cajon. Sasha herself wiggled beneath the bed, reaching the neck of the guitar and pulling it out. It was a black guitar that had stars on it, the center being the shape of a heart rather than a circle. How ironic, for the stars to be the design on the acoustic after spending so much time talking about them. It was almost poetic. At least, if she was a nerd, she'd make that connection. But she's not. Sasha brushed off the layer of dust, watching Marcy do the same, before moving the cajon in front of the bed. Once it was clean enough, Sasha sat on her bed, tuning the guitar as she watched Marcy settle on the instrument. Her friend was already tapping around on it to see how it sounds at each spot. Sasha made herself comfortable as she fixed the strings. What song do you want to play? Marcy thought for a moment. Hallelujah? Sasha snickered. Okay. For the next 2 hours, they played more songs, harmonizing when they both sang, but for the most part, Sasha led. The blonde smiled as Marcy yawned. A quick glance at the clock showed it was late. Marvels, we should go to bed. Marcy shook her head. One last song. Sasha sighed as she looked at Marcy softly. Okay. She had trouble saying no to her now. Which one? You choose. I chose the first. You choose the last. Sasha smiled, not bothering to hide her amusement. But I just chose the last one. Marcy waved her off, using the other hand to cover a yawn. Choose, so we can go to bed. Sasha snickered. Okay then. She went through every song she knew. What should she choose? A quick glance at her guitar and how much they talked about the stars provided her answer. Sasha smiled. How about Fly Me to the Moon? Marcy's eyes lit up, not enough to be rid of how tired she was, but enough to look more alive, and that was enough. It always would be. Marcy stared at the fire pit, sitting in her foldable seat, notebook on her lap. Sasha stood from her seat, looking down at the crackling fire. Are you ready? Marcy smiled at her. Yep. Got your flashlight? Marcy took out the small green light, blinking it on and off. And it works! Sasha nodded as she took out her pink one, fiddling it on and off as proof that she had hers as well. All right, I'll get the water. Marcy nodded as Sasha walked off. The pair were in an open area in the Catalina Islands. They had taken a boat out there and rented a car to spend the day out there. With both of them being 18, they were able to go out and do most things without permission. They went scuba diving, ziplining, a ropes course, hiking, and were now stargazing. To be fair, she hadn't done about half of that stuff, spending her time cheering Sasha on so she wouldn't overdo it with her legs. It was still pretty fun. But this would be the real highlight of her day. Or rather, her night. Okay, Sasha said. Ready? Marcy nodded her head, moving to stand as she smiled so wide she was pretty sure that her face would split in half. Sasha just laughed as she dropped an insane amount of water on the fire. A cloud of smoke erupted as Sasha finished. Marcy moved quickly, stopping on the ground to put out any embers. I think that's good, Marbles, Sasha said, hand pressed over her mouth so she wouldn't inhale too much of the smoke. Marcy backed away. I think so too. After a moment, it became clear that the fire wasn't going to relight. Both girls made sure their flashlights were off. They didn't want to add more light pollution, and glanced up. Marcy's jaw dropped as she let out a gasp. She could hear Sasha do the same, but couldn't tear her eyes away from the view. The sky was an assortment of blues, but what blew her away were the hundreds of stars. There were so many, they just kept going as far as she could see. It was almost like the nights in Amphibia. For a while, neither girl had spoken. They moved their seats closer together and were sitting, but no words were spoken. Marcy just stared at the sky, holding Sasha's hand to remind her that this was real. This was happening. The pair had stayed like that for an hour, not mumbling a single word, only taking it all in. Eventually, Sasha broke the silence with a whisper. Marcy, let go of my hand. Marcy let go instantly, trying her hardest not to look hurt. Did she do something wrong? Sasha looked amused. Jeez, don't look so hurt, Marbles. Marcy perked up as Sasha laughed. I'm just stretching. You mean you can't sit still for more than an hour? Sasha pouted, causing Marcy to laugh. I don't spend all my free time being a nerd like you. Whatever, Sash. Marcy turned her attention back to the sky. Every star was emitting so brightly. Slowly, Marcy raised a hand, drawing 2 constellations in the sky. Queen of the Universe and Marbles? It's Rofalocera, actually. Sasha gave her a strange look. That's what I said. Marbles. Marcy snorted. Yeah, whatever, Your Highness. Sasha put on an offended look. I'll have you know, Miss Wu, that you are lucky to even be in my presence. Marcy watched as Sasha flipped her hair around, nearly smacking herself with it. Marcy snickered, putting on her best serious face. Ah, but you see, I heard a rumor that... She paused, motioning for Sasha to come closer. The blonde leaned down, ready to listen. Her Highness is actually a whore. Marcy! Marcy couldn't help laughing as Sasha shocked a look, trying to sputter a response. Marcy grinned. Only a rumor, though. Yeah, Sasha mumbled. I won't get worked up, since that implies it would be true. Marcy snorted before glancing up again at the stars. Sasha followed her gaze. You know... Sasha paused until Marcy stared at her. She had a serious look, but a gentleness in her eyes. You were right to bring up the stars so much. They really are always there, too, even in other worlds. Marcy nodded, smiling. Yeah. They fell silent again, Marcy leaning on Sasha's shoulder. There was some nice weather, but anything was better than storms. Not that they got many in SoCal. In fact, the lack of them regularly made recovery pretty slow going. Do you think I'll ever be strong enough to get over my fear of thunder? I know it takes time, but it's been so long. Do you remember what you said to me that first night we spent together? Marcy froze for a sec, thrown off by Sasha calmly interrupting her. It wasn't new, just jarring. Even so, she shut her eyes tight, trying to remember what was mentioned all those years ago. But she was drawing blanks. It's okay if you don't, Sasha said, a smile on her lips as she stops Marcy from thinking about what forgetting might mean. It was a while ago. You had said something about the world not treating their stars well, or something like that. But the bit I wanted to focus on is what you had told me. Marcy stared at Sasha, confused. She couldn't remember what she had told Sasha. The blonde, for her part, raised their hands, the ones that were still holding each other. Marcy calmed down. She forgot that they hadn't let go yet. It grounded her. Sasha smiled. I just think that you need to be reminded of how far you've come after all of that. You don't have to do that. Sure, Marcy almost spiraled, but that didn't mean she wanted Sasha to pity her or to ruin this night. It's alright, Sasha replied. I want to help you. She took a deep breath, glancing at the stars one more time before looking at Marcy. I have a star in my hand right now, and despite all the harm the world has done, she still shines brightly. Marcy felt her eyes tear up before she launched herself in a hug at Sasha, knocking them both off their seats. Sasha let out a small oof, but made no move to get up, only hug back. Neither of them made a move to get up. They stayed like that for as long as they could, hugging and staring at the stars. Marcy let out a small sniffle, hearing Sasha do the same. She was right. They were still going strong and shining brightly. Their little cluster. Hey, Marcy? She hummed in response. I love you, to the end of the universe and back. Marcy froze for a moment, her breath hitching as Sasha ran her fingers through her hair. She loved her? Marcy couldn't stop the smile from spreading on her face, or the happy feeling bubbling up in her chest. I love you more than all the stars in the sky.